So here we are in Ken Miller's Oil and Gas Museum. I'm Jack Miller, Ken's oldest son. And every bit of oil in the world was made from whale oil before 1860. And the whale captains would make $2 million a year because they had all the oil in the world. If you ever read anything by Thomas Jefferson, he loved the whale oil because it burned smokeless. Then in 1816, in Titusville, Pennsylvania, Colonel Drake was drilling a saltwater well and he encountered oil. And later then he wrote this note that says, "My dear friend Wilson, if you have any of the milk of human kindness left in your bosom for me and my family, please give me some. I am in want of it fraternally and am sick." Because he went bankrupt, there was no place to sell the oil. And then along came a guy from Cleveland, Ohio. His name was John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller was vertically integrated. He took the oil, he had the trucking, the railroads, the pipelines, he controlled everything. And all the oil in the world was between Findlay, Ohio, where Marathon Oil is today, and Bradford, Pennsylvania. And there were 26 oil refineries in that area, and they called it the Cleveland Massacre. In one day, John D. Rockefeller bought 22 of those oil refineries. So he owned 90% of the world's largest industry, the oil and gas industry. And then Rockefeller did so well, and all the ancillary companies that worked for him did. Of the 68 wealthiest people in America, 53 lived on Euclid Street in Cleveland, from the public square to the Cleveland Clinic. So Rockefeller and the oil industry stopped the killing of whales. But back to Nantucket, when these men that made $2 million a year in 1860 could no longer exist in the whaling industry, you probably have heard of two of the fellows. What did they do with their money? One's name was Mr. Folgers. He bought a coffee company. Another ship sailor was lost at sea, followed a red star in, saved his life. So he tattooed a red star on his arm. His name was Mr. Macy, and he later bought a department store that you've all heard of that still has that red star on their buildings. And then now we're in the roots section, because Ken Miller, at age 16, here he is with the casing gang. Casing is steel pipe they'd run in the well, and when they drill a gas well in the Canton boom, gas would come through the men's clothes and make them look like they weighed 300 pounds. When you're running with your wrenches, screwing the pipe together, if you threw a spark, you would burn up. So the local drillers would not run the pipe. They hired the casing gang, these farm boys, my dad and all his uncles. But Ken Miller paid attention. He was on 200 wells in the Canton boom. If you're on 20, you're a petroleum engineer. And he talked to the drillers, learned about the shale break, the different sizes of sand, and how to complete a well. He had a petroleum engineer's knowledge while as a teenager. And then he married my mom, and they moved into this abandoned house. They had nothing. They had a bullet hole shot through the doors. And so us four children, my mom and dad, lived there till I was in the 5th grade, and all of us slept in one bed because we only had one bed. Then Ken Miller went into business for his own in the frac tank rental business, and his greatest claim to fame was he invented the straight truck. So to haul these frac tanks, everybody in the world hauled them on a tractor and trailer, but my dad, if only he had patented this, before school buses, he cut a tractor and trailer in half, stretched it 10 feet, bolted in U-joints and Detroit lockers in the rear wheels, and now we could haul tanks on a straight truck when everybody else in the world hauled them on a tractor and trailer. That revolutionized the tank industry, and myself and my brother-in-laws, Danny Allen and Ron Grosjean, drove those trucks for years. When I was 16, my dad said, "Jack, I know you don't know much about mechanics, but he said to drive a big truck, you only need two things, and I need you to drive one. All you need to know is drive that truck as long as you want without gasoline, but never without oil." So I became a truck driver, and then after driving a truck for 8 years, I was in a phone booth, and as a salesman made a $1 million sale in 1978. That was a lot of money in 1978. Called my dad and said, "I just made a $1 million sale on pipe." And he said, "New pipe? We don't have new pipe, we just have used pipe." I said, "That's right, get in the car, we're going to get some." So we went to a steel mill and got a pipe account, and that changed us in the pipe business. In 3 years, I became the leader of our company, and then my dad went into Ken Oil, which this wall of flame are all wells that Ken Miller has drilled. And we found out that every well there's about 10 feet of sand, but a lot of people would drill through the sand and would miss it. So when you see that wall of flame, every one of those is like a barbecue grill pipeline beside a well with propane in it. They would light that. Many drillers would miss that 10 feet of sand, would go right through it in a hurry, but not my dad. He always hit it because he'd see the flame and he'd know to hit and quit. He knew when to stop. So Ken Oil was very successful, and they hit 85% of the time, which most people in Ohio hit well 60% of the time. And then Dad in 1983, since Ken Oil didn't take as much time as our pipe companies, he started this oil and gas museum. These are gas pumps. Back then, you wanted to watch the gas run into your tank. So literally, when you said, "I'm pumping gas," you would pump. Once you got in 5 gallons, you wanted to watch that run into your tank. Incidentally, back when gas was 15 cents, they had 5 padlocks on the gas pump. And what really, about this time, I'd like to take you to the rotary drilling bit. So all the drilling rigs in the world would drill a well in a month, but Howard Hughes, the world's wealthiest man, invented this rotary drilling bit, and it would drill a well in a week. But Howard kept it secret for years. He had a company man on location, and when you pulled that bit out of the hole, even though it was your rig, you never saw the bit. Mr. Hughes would unscrew that bit, put it under his coat, and go to the next well. That's why Howard Hughes became the wealthiest, on the biggest industry in the world, became the wealthiest man in the world. So these are the products made from oil that a lot of people don't realize: antibiotics, aspirin, backpacks, bandages, combs, ice cube trays, any Rubbermaid product. Even the coating on M&Ms is made from petroleum. So our industry is very vital to the products that are made in the United States. So vital that in 1942 and 52, with this license plate from the cars that depict the oil and gas industry, the steel was not used for license plates. It was used for paper because all the bullets, all the steel went into bullets for the war. Next we'll go to the medicine section, because as I said, when Colonel Drake found the first oil, he went bankrupt. And so slick talkers would say, well, they had no place to sell it, so they say petroleum's a natural remedy. It'll cure windpipe, lungs, diarrhea, cholera, piles, burns, and scalds. It wasn't true, but they sold oil in quarts for people to drink. You've heard of snake oil salesmen. That's literally what these guys were. Next, the music section, because when you encounter oil and gas, even the landowners get 1/8 of it free. People got rich, so they wrote songs, they made movies, they got oil fever. They were getting rich quick. Next, we'll move into the horse section. So before the automobile and the truck, horses were the first way. Here's a 40-team hitch that people got produced their oil. That was the beast of burden. You can see how difficult moving anything on a horse and wagon was. The wagons would break down. The early union was the Teamsters Union. Actually, were Teamsters teams of horses. Here's band wheels broken down in the middle of the street. It was very, very difficult to use horses, and even more difficult before horses were cows. And the oxen would pull the products in and out, the pipe wagons and the service rigs. And this is how you made a drilling location. You had to have flat land. So the oxen would first use a plow to rough up the ground and make it loose. Then they would attach the oxen to a dump scrape, and it would pull this through, scrape up the loose dirt, then level it out. And that's how they'd make a drilling location flat. So here you can see the very primitive early ways of transporting oil and gas tools, oil and gas pipe. And that's a photographer's wagon that right there, but a lot of times you'd bring your pretty girlfriend out there and get your picture of your new girlfriend and your new well. This is the evolution of barrel hauling. They started out with just a couple barrels in a very crude wagon. They evolved into a bigger wagon, and they were pulled with teams of horses, so you couldn't pull too many at a time. And this, like Colonel Drake, when he hit the first oil well, there was no way to sell it, so this slick talker would go through town and he'd say oil was liquid electricity. It's a mecca for healing rheumatism, neuralgia, sprains. It'll cure anything. So that's what the early uses of oil were before they found out they could actually burn it as a fuel and run it in cars as a gasoline.
As oil and gas was being developed in Ohio and in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, early on they had no trucks. They had to figure out some way of moving their equipment. And of course in Ohio and Pennsylvania we have serious winters with a lot of snow and ice. Well, they found that the wagons did not travel very good in snow and ice, but yet they had all this heavy equipment to move. So then they developed a sleigh that could haul the heavy weight and would move along on the ground easily with the horses or the oxen. So these are different examples of the way they moved their equipment and their heavy things with a sleigh. And then later on they went to wagons. This is a wagon that was built to haul oil or salt water out of the well or even to bring fresh water into the well. The wagon to our left is a wagon that was used to haul oil by the barrel. There's actually a ramp there they would use. They'd get 3 men on a barrel, they'd push them up onto the wagon. They could haul 5 or 6 barrels at a time, which is a couple 100 gallon, maybe 300 gallon. At that time would have been a full load for a couple horses. So you can see that moving oil or any kind of equipment back then was very laborsome, and also it was really difficult to get much volume moved at one time.
This is a Frick steam boiler. The wealthiest man in the world was Rockefeller, then Carnegie, then Frick from Pittsburgh. And so they were in many, many industries, but the steam would drive the engine to drill the well. Ken Miller was really smart. For our 25th year anniversary, he had this cast iron pumping unit that actually works made for all of our customers. Back then we had 2,500 customers. Then Dad broke the mold. So here we are, a 60-year-old company now. We were Churchill Manufacturers' largest seller of pumping units, largest distributor. They were the world's largest manufacturer of pumping units. And now my dad, this unit costs $10, but when they are sold today at an auction, they bring about $300. So this is Ken Miller's first truck, a 1949 GMC. Dad had nothing, and he bought a truck wrecked, but there's a story that goes with the truck. So on this truck, it had a big hole in the seat, and the previous owner was going down through over a hill back of Lease Road, and a big old snake came winding up out of that seat. So the guy opened the door, stood on the running board, and rode it as long as he could. Finally, he turned to the snake and he said, "She's all yours." So the truck went down the bottom of the hill and wrecked. My dad bought it wrecked, fixed it up, and then when my dad, about 2 miles away from Miller Supply, pulled into, he had us 4 kids at home and had purchased 4 frac tanks to rent, pulled into his first location, and the motor went out of his truck. And so my dad sat on this running board and cried and was going to go back in and ask Buckeye Supply for his old job. And the first guy down the road, as luck would have it, was a fuel oil delivery man, Bill Hughes. And he said, he saw my dad there very sad, and he said, "What's the matter, Ken?" And Dad said, "My motor went out of my truck, I'm ruined, I'm going back and ask for my old job." And Bill said, "Hell, Ken, for $700, you can get a rebuilt motor and put in that truck." And thank goodness that's what my dad did. It's interesting, this was a tractor and trailer back then, and on my dad's first job, he never yet has been paid. These are very early wooden drilling rigs. Before metal, they had wood, and they built them 60 to 80 feet high so they could pulverize the ground and drill with them. They're very, very primitive. You notice there's one along the railroad tracks, one on 3 levels. And my dad's first job when he was 16 was to climb up 86 feet high and change the crown pulley sheave. So he had to go up there, take the wire from one sheave to the other that was worn out 86 feet off the ground and change it. It was a very dangerous operation in a very dangerous industry. So this is my dad's first nice pickup truck, and he put 100,000 miles on it and then pulled it into this museum. You know, my dad and I had lunch together for 30 years. We got along very well. As I remember, we only had 2 arguments. One was when he wanted to put brand new tires on his pickup truck and then pull it in this museum. These tires don't have 10 miles on them. And the second argument, I had a house full of people. We were in my basement where we have a player piano, and I would only play and sing 2 verses of I Saw Mama Kissin' Santa Claus with my dad, and we argued because I didn't play a 3rd verse. So these are very early primitive tools of the trade, but I want to point your attention to a rat tail wrench. So outside we're going to point to a steel derrick that is 48 feet off the ground, and 7 of us built it in 1.5 days with 2 rat tail wrenches. So you'd be 40 feet off the ground, you'd stick the rat tail through to line up steel to steel, the bolt holes, then you'd stick the bolt through this end, then you'd take the other end of the rat tail wrench, screw it tight, and made sure it was tight because you're 48 feet off the ground. Then the guy'd say rat tail, and you threw it to him, and he'd catch it. So that's how they drilled early wells. From Worcester to Kilbuck, there's 30 miles of swamps, and the ground only falls 7 feet. So in the old days, they used to mine ice. These are ice wagons that the town of Shreve took out on the Shreve swamps, and then they would saw the ice with these ice saws. They would harpoon it, bring it back into them. Then they would take this implement and break off the ice. Then they would load these wagons and use it for the refrigeration for the town of Shreve. Also, they'd put them on railroad cars to New York City. In sawdust, ice would last quite a long time. I trapped on the Shreve swamps in 1969. When my school teachers made $5,000 in a year, I made $1,000 in a month trapping muskrats and coon in the Shreve swamps. So this is an early steam engine from Titusville, Pennsylvania, and that's where it all started, the first oil well. And they had to kick start them. So it ran a big belt that ran the drilling rig, so the pumper would have to start it like this. And a lot of times when it got to spinning real fast, a man would slip and get inside it, and it would beat him to death. So it was a very dangerous operation. Then later in life in Orrville, Ohio, Sanderson Cyclone made a drilling engine that replaced old engines like this. My dad came in one day and said, "Look at this washing machine, Jack. You know how dirty our clothes get in the oil and gas business, and this one will do 3 things." I said, "What do you want a washing machine for an oil and gas museum?" He said, "It cost $1. Do you think I paid too much?" So this is a 1916 Volvo white truck. My dad and mom drove this in many parades. In the Canton Pro Football Hall of Fame parade, they got stopped by a man that said, "I'm the CEO of Volvo White. I make trucks, and this is nicer than our company show truck." And that must have been about 1990, and they offered my dad $50,000 for it, which he wouldn't take because it was his favorite truck. This is a 1915 Packard. It's one of the earliest forms of transportation in the oil and gas industry. It has hard rubber tires, never had a flat, chain drive, and the Smithsonian said it's nicer than their Packard. They would like to get it. This is a 1915 Bernstein. It came out of Northwest Ohio. Findlay, Ohio in 1890 was the largest oil field in the world. If you go to Findlay, Ohio today, there's 1 square block, 6 or 8 stories high of Marathon's offices. The Bernstein hauled pipe and equipment in and out of the Findlay oil field. So this is the jerry can. It was made by the Germans, but we stole the technology for our armed forces in World War II. It was ingenious. I could carry it with one hand if it's empty. If it's full, 2 of us could carry it. It's stacked this way and that way. Hitler ran out of fuel, but we didn't because we had 21 million jerry cans that were filled and provided by women, and we won the war. Unit of measure of oil is 42 gallons, but a barrel holds 55 gallons because in these early primitive refineries, the oil would shake out of the barrels if it be on the water, and the average unit of measure, 42 gallons, was left in a barrel. Today, if there's an oil spill, there's no such thing as a gallon of oil, but the EPA tries to magnify every spill 42 times. They say it's so many gallons of oil. To make it sound worse, for example, instead of saying I weigh 200 pounds, if you said you weigh 3,200 ounces, makes me sound a little heavier, doesn't it? So to plug wells, I always used cast iron plugging balls, and it didn't matter because the price of oil was $3 from 1860 to 1973. But then in 1974, during the Arab oil embargo, the price spiked up to $14.77. And so now, when they plugged wells, they put in cement plugs that you could go back and drill out an old well, to get after the more expensive priced crude. And my dad had his own cement plug business, and it was my job when I was 5 years old and older to put in the handles. When you have a location for drilling wells, oftentimes it's in a woods, so you had to go in the lumber section, saw the trees down, climb with climbing spurs, and that's an Ottawa drag saw to cut up the firewood, clear the location so you could drill a well. So out in western Ohio, they went door to door with this until 1918, and they would get in the back and deliver fuel oil right to the ladies' houses so they could fill their oil lamps. And my dad heard that BP was going to put it in their new showroom of their office. They said, we'll bid $5,000 for it, and he got there ahead of them and bid $5,100. So that's the last load this vehicle hauled was in 1918.
Early on when they started drilling, they built wood derricks called standard rigs. And then later they moved to steel. Carnegie Steel built a lot of rigs that were standard and hand built. Well, as they moved along in the early 1900s, drilling rigs were very cumbersome and time consuming to build. So Star Drilling Company started to build a portable rig like this one you see here, and it was pulled with horses or oxen. And it could be set up quickly. It had a walking beam to do the drilling. You could do the swabbing with it, the baling. It was kind of one machine that would do the whole job. And as this developed, it got to be more and more popular. They would use it for a workover machine and needed a portable type machine that would handle a job quicker. And as the Ford company and others started to build trucks, they built a machine like this one. This is a Star drilling machine also. And then 1906 was put under a truck. So it was self-propelled, and that even made their job a lot easier and a lot quicker. And soon the horses and the oxen were eliminated because of the natural gas combustion engine.
These trucks show the evolution of swabbing trucks. Each swabbing truck has a reel or a winch at the back end with a very small cable, so it can go down 5,000 feet in a well. Natural gas is the cleanest, most efficient, cheapest, abundant fuel in the world, but every hole in Ohio that has natural gas also has fluid get in the hole, either water or oil. So you need a swabbing rig when you don't have a pumping unit. Just like you take a Q-tip and swab out your ears, they run these lines down into the hole. They have suction cups on them. When they pull them out, they have a column of fluid ahead of them. When the fluid's out of the hole, the gas can be produced. My grandpa drove that truck and I rode with him. Then he evolved from these earlier trucks. In 1918, this Model T Ford Swabber is much nicer than the one in the Smithsonian Institute. They've been here numerous times to try to buy it from us. And that swabbing wagon from Medina Gas, my grandpa with a horse-driven swabbing wagon worked for the Medina Gas Company. Those are my grandpa's gauges, his boots, his hat, and his dinner pail. So this is an authentic 1910 depot hack. That's what the entrepreneurs would come into town with a Wells Fargo strong box, and the entrepreneurs were well dressed. They were looking to make a deal. Here's a wealthy guy coming into town down in West Virginia where there's oil and gas activity. Here they're making a deal. I'll meet you in the middle of the street. Sometimes deals were successful, sometimes they were unsuccessful, for sale cheap. But the verse of scripture that goes with the oil and gas industry is Matthew 25:35. I came to you a stranger and you took me in, because many people have been hoodwinked in the oil and gas business. As a matter of fact, our Ken Oil Company, I have a file this thick of convicted felons that have been Ken Oil's partners. And we even had to hire convicts in the oil and gas business because that's the only people we could find to work with us. I remember it's a tough industry. You have to throw your clothes away a lot. It's dangerous. When I was a teenager, my dad said, now Jack, on Monday, you're going to be working with a couple guys that just got out of jail. They've been in there for 2 months. And I said, what did they do? He said, these guys threw the Holmes County Sheriff through the picture window in the Glenmont bar. So this is a hazard section. Oil is flammable, so here's a spill on the river, and when you get it on fire, it's a black cloud of smoke. It's very, very difficult to put out. Molten steel, the pipelines all melt. This is a fireman's bucket because it can't be stolen. when you're handing out a bucket in a bucket brigade, the local dairy farmers couldn't set that bucket down. It would tip over.
As the steam engines went by the wayside, the natural gas engines were still being used. The drilling company started going deeper after deeper formations and needed more and more power. So like Young Engineering and Waukesha companies were able to develop larger engines that ran on diesel fuel. And some of them actually ran on natural gas, but they would be able to put a pull in the clutch and they would be able to do heavier labor, heavier work, and succeed in drilling deeper with more horsepower, which was very important in the industry of oil and gas. Okay, this is a yellow dog. Early on, they didn't have electricity or batteries for flashlights, and they had lanterns, but they had a lot of crude oil. And crude oil didn't burn good in a lamp. So they developed this item here called a yellow dog. And the reason it was called a yellow dog is that you would put crude oil in this, and then you had a wick on both sides. And as this would burn, especially at night, off at a distance, you'd see two yellow flames, and it would look like two eyes looking at you. So they called it a yellow dog. And that was what you used for light because you had crude oil available, and you could light this and see your way around the rig and out in the field.
So this is the Alaskan pipeline, actual size, 48-inch pipe, made in Japan because America didn't have a mill that would go that large. And they said it would be devastating to the bear population. But there's permafrost in Alaska. The pipeline was above the ground. The bear go under it. There's no problem at all with the bears. Not true. This is a band wheel. And Ron, Danny, and I, for years, hauled things like this in for my dad. So this would suspend a big belt that worked on that Tyco engine you saw earlier. But when they put in a new cant, this is a new cant, a new section, it would stick out more than the others because it wasn't worn down. So this driller made a homemade plane by driving nails through. As this belt was spinning 100 miles an hour, every time it came around, he'd have his knee, zzz, zzz, and he'd plane it down.
As oil and gas was being drilled, my brother-in-law mentioned this earlier, that a lot of times the well would fill up with fluid, oil or salt water, and they had to figure out some way of getting that water or fluid off the hole. So Henry Ford heard of this problem, and he built a couple of different prototypes that would actually have a reel on it that would run a wire line. They could run it into the well and put a swab on that, swab the fluid out. So Fordson kind of pioneered the swabber rig, and then Alice Chalmers, the rig behind me here, actually got caught on to the same project, and they developed a lot of different type swab rigs, even ones with a pole. We have one displayed outside also.
These are the different kind of oil samples in Ohio. In Ohio, a barrel of crude gets divided 1/3 gasoline, 1/3 diesel, and 1/3 lubricants after it's refined. So drillers on a cable tow rig, it was a very tough job to dress the bits, to make the steel bits sharp. So first they'd get them red hot in a forge, then two men would each have a 16-pound sledge. I'd hit it, you hit it. I hit it, you hit it, and that's how they'd make the bit sharp. But at the beginning of the hole, the bits are much bigger. 13-inch at the top of the hole, then it goes down to 9-inch bits, then it goes down to 5-inch bits. So the old smart drillers, when they started sledging, they'd say, I have diarrhea, I've got to head for the woods. So the old drillers would be in the woods, and the young man would be sledging all day on both sides. And one driller only weighed 120 pounds, and then he developed the bit ram. So he'd get back, and he'd hit it like this, skip, skip, boom, skip, skip, boom, and that's how he'd hit it, but he let go of it. And this thing chased him all around the drilling rig, and he never did it again. Next, we'll go to the pipeline section. So in the pipeline section, all the pipelines, imagine the men had to screw it together with these tongs. They had to plow out to make it a place to bury it underground below plow depth. Here they are hauling pipe on a 40-horse hitch. If you notice, the pipeliners had to work in the wintertime. They traveled in tent city. They even had aprons on because the cooks traveled right with the pipeline. Here they have a coffer dam. They stopped flowing water to lay the pipeline across the stream. And you can see on a hill, they had to use a jackboard like this to keep the pipe level. Pipelining was a very, very tough way to go. Before fracking, nitroglycerin shot would make a 200 foot cavern at the bottom of a well instead of a 4-inch hole. So they would take nitroglycerin and transport it in wagons like this. All the tools had to be made from bronze. If you threw a spark, it would blow up. So those are brass nitroglycerin shooting tools, and they would store it out in the middle of the woods where if it blew up, it wouldn't harm anyone. The shooter was just about always an alcoholic, someone that couldn't get another job. He'd be come out shaken, but when you handed him the nitro, he was smooth as silk. And he'd pour it in a cup, and then he would send a Go Devil, one of these devices. They would drop it in the hole, then everybody ran like hell. Here is a successful shot from oil. It would blow over the mast. Here's a successful shot from gas. Sometimes the wagon didn't make it all the way to the location, so here's an unsuccessful shot, the shooting wagon that got broken up on the way to the well site. So in 1981, the price of oil and gas was very good, so we drilled this farm and fracked the wells on this farm. So here we are with our young children. My son there is 44 today, so there he was about 6. So you can see how long ago it was. We drilled it with a cable tool. These are our frac tanks. And since the EPA did a study a couple years ago with a group called Stronger, you can Google it. Since 1948, we've been fracking wells. Never ever has a frac come up the hole and got into the fresh water. That statement's from the EPA. But in 2007, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources asked me to go to Cleveland and speak in front of 200 Jones Day attorneys and 300 environmentalists. And so here's what I told them about the upcoming shale horizontal drilling and if it was dangerous or not. So first I had them all go like this. And I said, if you do not have city water, this is how you protect your water well from a dog going to the bathroom and it going into your water. So you think this thick is good protection if you're in the country or not in a city. The state of Ohio has mandated, this is what the casing program looks like on every shale well. If you were in a helicopter and looked down, this is what you'd see. The white is cement or concrete, and the black is the thickness of the steel pipe. So if everybody now in the audience would go like this, there's a column of steel and cement this thick going down 5,000 feet around every well, so there's no way a frac can go up and go into your fresh water. So farming and oil and gas go in hand. We're married to the farmer for like 30 years when we have a well on their farm. One of the first good tractors was the Silver King because it would go 35 miles an hour. You could take your plow out to the field real fast to plow it, or you could take your family to town.
A lot of the early wells were drilled out on a farm somewhere. They didn't have gravel roads or blacktop to get to them. So a lot of times it was inclement weather, the weather was muddy, but that well needed swabbed. So Cleveland Track Company built a dozer that actually has a swab reel on the back. And then the operator could actually run the swab reel. He could be the operator for the dozer, and he could also swab the well and go in and out without any assistance. So that was a big draw for Cle-Track, and they sold a lot of tractors that way. Cleveland Track Company later out in the 40s then sold out to Oliver Corporation. The Farmers Union Co-op wanted to build a tractor, but after the war there wasn't tractors available or nobody had access to the parts. General Motors had a lot of truck parts, engines and transmissions, but they couldn't sell them because the war effort had quit drawing the draw for that type of equipment. So Farmers Union talked to GM and they built a tractor called the Farmers Co-op tractor. They had 3 models. They used a truck engine, a truck transmission, and rear end. This tractor could be used in the field at low range, low gears, and if you wanted to go to town, it would go 45 mile an hour. So that was their selling point. However, the other tractor designs were more fit the farmer's use, so it wasn't never very popular. The oil and gas industry would use a plow like this to go back and forth on location. This is a tumble plow. You go to one side of the location, you pull the rope, it tumbles back, you go the other way, it loosens the soil. They take a bulldozer, push the dirt away to make a flat location for the rig. This is kind of a neat thing. This is a horsehair picking machine, and early on you had oxen and you had mules and horses. As the mules and horses wore out, They would take the hides, cure the hides, they would slice them in slices, run them through this machine, they would take the hair off the hide. The hair would be used in pillows and in seats and trucks. Actually, they used to use it in plaster in your homes, but they also used it for temporary shelters over the rig hands, over the shanties. They made roof shingles out of the hides, and those hides would last very well and were reused in many cases.
So this is a 1919 Huber. This was the first thing after the horse to hit the field for the farmer. And this is nicer, much nicer than the one the Smithsonian has. They've tried to get it. Notice it has a sideways radiator. That was before they realized the fan cools the motor and is necessary. It has a sideways motor. The driver drove it standing up, and the farmers would not buy it because they said these wheels would pack down the earth, unlike the horse, and so a tractor was no good.
This is an early style open gear pumping unit. On shallow wells, as we talked earlier, you had to bring the fluid out of the well with a swab rig. So they developed a wood sucker rod that would go down in the well casing that would attach onto each one. They could go 2,000 feet deep with these. Then it would attach to the end of this unit, and this would go up and down in a pumping motion. As that went up and down, that would pump the oil out, and it would be piped into a tank like this wood one here beside us. This is a central power pumping unit, which had its own power, and a lot of these were used with shackle lines. They would run cables out through the field with a turntable, and they could pump 5 or 6 wells at a time. This one here was used for one well by itself. However, they would hook on a cable to the other end, and they could pump 2 or 3 wells with one engine doing the same process. This would be the center over one well, where that would pump onto another cable and pump 2 or 3 wells at the same time. In the early stages of drilling, they would use a soft rope for their cable. The cable rope would break, they'd get stuck in the hole, and then they'd lose their drilling bit. So in the big hole, they had to have some kind of a tool to go in there to attach to the bit that fell off and fish it out of the ground. So these are early type fishing tools that were used to go in and fish out the baler or the drill bit and stem that were lost in the hole. And as they needed something, they built it on location or in a near foundry, and they didn't go to the store to buy it. They had to make what they needed. Just like this is hand forged, that would be to get a hold of a cable or rope or to clean the hole up. This is an example of an 18-inch drilling bit. This is what they would start the hole with on a standard rig. You had to start a big hole, and the first casing you would put in many times was 10 3/4 in size and diameter. But you had to have a bigger hole than that to get the pipe in. So this would be what you'd use to start the hole with. As they drilled the hole and they got to smaller depths, shallow or larger, deeper depths, then they used a smaller bit. But each time they run another bit, they had to run another size casing. So a lot of times it would be 11 3/4, 10 3/4, 8 5/8, 7-inch, 5-inch or 4-inch, even sometimes 3-inch to be your production string at the very bottom. When the early drilling was started, there wasn't any OSHA, there wasn't any safety rules. It would just kind of be out there and be on your own. And a lot of men lost legs, lost fingers, hips, and lost their lives. So as the industry emerged, evolved, safety became a big factor. Even today, it's probably one of the 10th most cost of drilling a well is the safety part of the location. The fire, the chemicals, the injury. It's really a serious part of drilling a well today, and the companies take very serious of that problem. As early on when we started to drill wells, the gas was a problem. Natural gas was just being vented off and burnt because they wanted the crude oil. So as time progressed, they felt that they needed to capture that gas and use it for other things, heating houses, heating business, running factories. So they developed huge separators. The natural gas and fluids would all go into a vessel like this. Then there would be a valve on there that would allow the fluids to go to the bottom and the natural gas to go to the top. The fluids would enter out of the bottom into one tank, and the gas would come out of the top and go into a pipeline. So these are early models of separators, which have evolved into a huge different type machine today. Some of this equipment hanging on my right is different tools. These are actually tool wrenches that were used to break your tools apart, your drilling stem, your jars, your bit. These are blocks that would be hanging from the top of the derrick. They would put a cable over this, and that was what they used to raise and lower their equipment. This is a dolly that would be used on the center tub to bring the pipe in and out. This is actually a set of elevators that would be used for 4-inch that would be hooked on to this cable that would raise the pipe up into the derrick and screw it on a joint and then let it down into the well. Okay, before drilling rigs were developed very highly and they had no engines or way of lifting and drilling, this was actually called a stem pole drilling. And they used a spring type. They'd hook their foot into the rope. This would be tied onto the pipe, the bit into the well, and they would actually start a motion of drilling. As they would drill, they would make some more hole. So you'd have a man on this crank, he would let the rope come down and let the drilling go deeper. Then the same deal, when they get the fluid out, they'd stop, run a baler into the hole, bring the fluid out with the crank. It was all done by hand. This is earliest drilling, spring pole drilling. These are different pulleys that have been used on drilling rigs. On the very top of the rig, you'd have a cable that would go over top. The first one here was actually used for rope before they had steel cable, because it had a bigger diameter, so it had to have a bigger sheave. This had been used for a small cable, like for baling. This one also. These are more of a drilling cable. This one here would have been for a rope. This one here was actually for rope. Later they used it for steel, and the steel cable actually made it cause a groove into that bearing. These all would be on the top of the drilling rig. They have to be taken up there by rope or by man or horsepower or oxen. You can imagine moving one of these big things on top of a rig 80 feet in the air. What a job that would have been. Behind me are steam boilers that were used to create steam, to create the power early on before gas engine and combustible engine were developed. These boilers would be fired with wood or coal. Then they had a cooling system in them that would they had to put water in that, and that water jacket had to stay water. As they heated up, it would create steam. The steam was captured in a vessel, and that was vented into a pipeline and used for the power source. Behind me is a ditching machine. As they started to build pipelines, they did it all by hand with shovels. So they developed machines like this one behind me here. This is a wheel machine that would actually dig the ditch for them. It was self-propelled. You could dig 6-7 feet deep. This machine could eliminate 20 men a day very easily. Today we have a pumping unit on wells that make fluid, and this is a modern version of a small unit, would be used on a 600 or 700 foot well. This has a gearbox which allows this to go up and down. The weight counteracts the string weight of the sucker rods. As that goes up and down, it brings the fluid out of the well, it goes into a pipeline and enters into a tank battery like down on the end here. So this is a modern version, and it had electric for power. Today we still use many of these with gas-fired engines, and because out in the field a lot of times electric is not available. But this is a very modern version of what we're using yet today.
So these are cars just like the cars my dad had. These aren't his cars, but he had these cars. So my dad gives a much better tour than me. If you're with him, he'd say, when I was in that 1949 Plymouth, had you 4 kids in the back seat, went to Bradford, Pennsylvania, and bought our first load of pipe that I never got paid for. And he'd tell stories like that. That 1941 Chevrolet is our most valuable car because it's a coupe. It has no back door, just a 2-door car, and that makes it very valuable. I remember riding in that 1955 black and red Dodge, and the 1958 Edsel, he was fascinated by the whole Ford story. This is interesting. Edsel had a horse collar grill, and they had push-button steering. And Edsel, there's nothing wrong with the Edsel, but they had a man named John McNamara that worked for Ford, and he invented the Ford Fairlane. And that same year as they made Edsel, the Fairlane came out and sold $200 cheaper. So that's why everybody bought the Fairlane. That light green truck is a 1921 REO. RE stood for the RE Olds Company, and one singing group came outside and they saw on the hood of a truck, REO Speedwagon. So that's what they named themselves. So in 1959, 10 miles from here, Paul Wirt was a pipeline constructor, And he was really good mechanically, so he invented this car. It was the fastest car in the world in 1959. It had 4 engines and 4 synchronized transmissions. So he would put the word out to the locals from Moreland, like Ron Grosjean, Gloria Yo, my wife Debbie, and he'd say, be on 11 o'clock, be on the square. I'm going to show you how this car runs. He would turn off 2 engines. The gas would fill the exhaust, then he'd turn it back on. It would shoot flame from here to that wall, 80 or 100 feet behind it. And he found out that the Bonneville Salt Flats had a guy break the speed record about 200 miles an hour, and he couldn't quite get there. So instead of taking it there and setting the world's record, he let it travel with the Nolan Brothers local circus, and it went around and people could pay tickets to get in and see this car. Mr. Word also invented a pipeline trenching machine, which is over there. It was a road bore machine rather, and he was one of the first people to ever bore the roads. So in 1981, my dad and I went to Weston, West Virginia. We bought out West Virginia's largest pipe supplier. That gave us the Wheeling-Pittsburgh steel pipe account. And we drove around on the windy roads to see their 3 stores in West Virginia. I actually got sick coming out of this Cadillac. And when my dad went to turn it in, they would only offer him $1,000 or so he just said, put it in the museum. So Hank Miller was my uncle, very successful in the trucking business, a good friend of Governor James Rhodes. He made 3 runs a day in this truck from Worcester to Canton. Today, men say on a good 4-lane highway, they can't do 2 runs. Anyway, this truck had gotten away from him, and it was somewhere between here and Logan, Ohio, and I was a field salesman. He said, find that truck for me, Jack. So I was in every hillbilly's backyard, I was in every junkyard, and I found the truck. Told him about it, and he drove down to buy it from the man in a brand new Cadillac with a 3-piece suit on, and a hillbilly had it, and my uncle offered him $500, and he wouldn't sell it to him. He said, I won't sell you that truck at any price. So he came home defeated, and he said, Jack, go down there and get that truck for me. So I thought about it, and I did some research on Tubby Hindell, the hillbilly that owned it. And so I went up to Tubby, and I held a fifth of Jack Daniels in a $100 bill. And I said, you know, Tubby, I'm a nice guy, and just kind of like to buy this truck. And we talked there quite a while. Pretty soon I saw Tubby lick his lips, and I knew we had him. So I got it for a fifth of Jack Daniels in a $100 bill. So this is a 1958 International, and I hate this truck because when I was 12 years old, 4 years before I could drive, they'd always haul me to the site. This is how we loaded all our pipe. We'd plug 100 wells a year and haul it back in, and I had to be inside running the winch all day. It had poles on the back and a winch that would go over the poles, and that was my job to load the trucks like that. With the men got to be outside. It was very hot in there, and we never stopped for lunch because lunches would boil up in the truck. So we always came in whenever we got done. It didn't matter if it was 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and when you're 12, that was a long day. And then later, this was before then actually, it was a tractor and trailer, and we were moving tanks. And the first day, our one truck driver that trained everybody, Myron Maurer, would never talk to you the first year. So they were in Ashtabula, which is 4 hours from now, from here, on the roads in those days, in this truck. And a new man was in there, and at 8 o'clock at night he said, are we going to stay up here somewhere? Myron said yes. So they drove and worked another 4 hours, and at midnight he said, where are we going to stay? And Myron said, in the International Hotel. And he said, where's that? And he said, you're sitting in the front lobby right now. They worked 24 hours, and when that young man came back to work, we were just coming in for the next day's work at 7:30 in the morning, because we always had to work till the job got done, and that guy never even clocked out. He got in his car and went home, and we've never seen him since. So outside we have my dad's first trailer, the red trailer, and then also we have that little tiny gray office building, and that's what he had when I was in the 6th grade. I remember because Dad used to come to school all the time. It was just him in the business, and he'd ask, can I have my son, and sometimes my sons. So I was in the 6th grade, my brother was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, and he'd get us out of school to go measure pipe. So we'd hold the dumb end of the tape because Dad couldn't measure pipe by himself. And the rig outside is that 48-foot tower that we built with 2 rat tail wrenches. When we built it 20 years ago, it was the last standard rig that had been built in 50 years. And that one's 48 feet high. If you can imagine one 86 feet high, my uncle, Fatley Atley, was drunk, and he climbed up there. They said, change the crown pulley for us. And so he climbed up 86 feet high, 2 sections down from the top, so it would be 76 feet high. They had a 10-foot steel ladder, had 2 bolts in it, one at the bottom, one at the top. And as the drilling rig would shake, the bolt worked loose and fell out of the top. So when Atlee grabbed that, drunk, 76 feet high, it slammed him backwards 3 times, and he hung on and was just cussing and hollering terrible. They climbed up there and fished him out, and when he hit the ground, he was sober. My dad was very proud of our war effort, and especially how we fought on Iwo Jima. And so Dad put a float in the Shreve parade with his local hero, Ernie Enfield. There he is in that white coat to honor him. Well, the parade was about 5 miles per hour, and we lived 2 miles from where the parade ended. So Ernie was sitting on a hay wagon on that chair. And when my dad was in a hurry to get home, he came 55 miles an hour. That man was sitting on nothing but that chair with that overcoat on, and the wind blew it behind him straight out. You could have played a game of cards on it. But fortunately, he never fell off. And my dad really loved Ernie Enfield. Every year we'd hunt pheasants. For 20 years, Ernie Enfield, my dad, and I, and the Ralph Lucas, the head of the Ohio State Highway Patrol, we'd shoot 30 or 40 pheasants. Then we'd have a pheasant dinner right across from here in the Cow Palace, a barn we fixed up for 50 people. When my dad and Ernie Enfield weren't quite themselves in our last couple of years, there's 50 men from the community, and they'd be county commissioners, judges, attorneys, bankers. And so first my dad gave the prayer, and he said, Lord, just thank you for these men from all walks of life. There'd be Jews, agnostics, Catholics, and then good Bible-believing, God-fearing Christians. And that's how the prayer would start. And then next they would each take turns naming the 50 people who were there. Here's banker Joe Smith, a good guy, I've known him for 10 years, Porter Crum. He's a pharmacist, owns his own place. And the next guy, my dad said, I don't know. And he's one of yours, Ernie. Ernie said, he's not one of mine. And Dad said, well, he's not one of mine. Ernie said, he's not one of mine. And Dad said, young man, tell us who you are. And he said, Ernie, I'm your son-in-law of 6 years. So this is my mother when she died unexpectedly of a heart attack at age 74 years old. She's a beautiful lady, 74 years old. She accompanied my dad everywhere. And my mom did everything for my dad. Even though he was very good at business and making money, my dad said some men are highly intelligent and some men know how to make money. Which would you rather be? Anyway, so my dad came to work one day and he said, you know how tough your mom is, Jack? And I said, oh yeah. And he said, she actually had to crawl out, she hurt her back, and she actually had to crawl out to the kitchen this morning to pour the milk on my cereal. So this is my dad with his first frac tank. When he had them numbered 1 through 10, some local industry fellow said, you have 10 tanks, you're rich. So my dad changed them to ladies' names. And later, he accumulated 500 frac tanks. We were the world's largest 300-barrel frac tank rental company. All were named women's names. Above my dad's desk, he had a picture of Jesus. And I'll have to say, my dad being a Christian cost him a lot more business than it got him business. Here my dad was Businessman of the Year in 2001 or 2, and he hadn't worked at our company for 20 years. Only my dad could pull that off. So in 1976 at the Wayne County Fair, my dad was always painting up tanks in honor of something. And this was that Wayne County was #1 for the 200-year celebration. And that's my mom when she was 46. She was still very, very beautiful. And my dad when he was 50. And this is my dad's office, just like it was when he lived across the street. We moved over there when I was in the 6th grade. And it's got many things that he did throughout his career. My dad wanted to make sure of his faith. So here he was immersed and baptized in his 60s, even though he had been saved as a teenager in a revival meeting. Because of that, my dad loved revivals, and he traveled with evangelist Jimmy Rose 40 nights one year. My dad and mom led the music. My mom was quite an accomplished pianist, traveling for Jimmy Rose. Here's our local high school team that was the best ever in 1976. So my dad painted up a tank, and then he had all the kids stand on top of the tank, so they'd be remembered forever. And my dad, this was his desk, his briefcase, just like it was, and we loved our dad very much. And right across there, when he was dying in his bedroom, he always had country music television on, and I've never heard this song before or since, and my family really enjoys humor, but Vince Gill came on and he sang this song. It's hard to kiss the lips at night that chewed my ass all day. And right about an hour before my dad passed away, the family had a nice laugh over that. And that just was kind of how my dad exited this earth. My dad started this museum in 1983, and we've kept it going for 36 years, actually 19 years after he quit operating it. And he thought things should be saved, our industry should be preserved, and people could see the humble roots from which our industry started.
Well, in 1983, he had a few things accumulated already, but he decided to build the first building, and he felt that some of our stuff would be good in here. Plus, he was on the search always for different items that would be related to the oil and gas industry in the early 1900s to show how hard our ancestors had to work to get a barrel of oil out of the ground.
In here, it shows everything. Of course, the combustible engine really put oil and gas industry on wheels. It helped in the war effort, it helps in our national security. And so everything connected, the license plate, the car, the truck, the gas pump, the bulldozer, it all comes from our industry, including many ancillary products, like all the Rubbermaid products, for example, are petroleum-based.
Younger generations today have no idea how hard we have to work and how much money is spent to get a barrel of oil out of the ground to produce natural gas. They think they can go to Lowe's and get what they need. They go to the gas pump to get their gasoline. They don't worry about heating their house because it's all done for them. It's all through a pipeline. And it's so simple now, but yet there's a lot of work goes into it. And we want to make sure that the younger people realize that it didn't happen on a cell phone. Our family has been able to be very successful because of the oil and gas industry. And I'd like our grandkids and great-grandkids to understand how that all developed. And I think that would be important for our friends and family to remember that. And our generation worked very hard to accomplish this. And we put a lot of hours in gathering this collection. And I feel it's very important that we preserve this history for the young people today so they know what we had when we started.